An unexpected party. Paddington paused on the stairs of number 32 Windsor Gardens and sniffed the morning air. A few moments later, having consulted the Browns' calendar through the banisters, he hurried on his way with a puzzled expression on his face. There was definitely something mysterious going on that morning, and he couldn't for the life of him figure out what it was. Unless Mrs. Bird had made a mistake when she'd changed the date, which would have been most unusual, and unless he'd also overslept by 2 or 3 days, which seemed even more unlikely, it should have been a Thursday. And yet all the signs were pointing to Sunday. To start with, there was a strong smell of freshly baked cakes coming from the direction of the kitchen. Although Mrs. Bird occasionally did her baking during the week, she was much more inclined to do it on a Sunday. In any case, she never made cakes quite so early in the morning. Then there was the strange behavior of Mr. Brown. Mr. Brown worked in the City of London and followed a strict timetable in the mornings. Breakfast was served punctually at 8:30, and before that, come rain or shine, he always took a quick stroll around the garden to inspect the flower beds. On this particular morning, Paddington had nearly fallen over backwards with surprise when he'd drawn back his curtains and peered out of the window, only to see a very unkempt-looking Mr. Brown pushing a wheelbarrow down the garden path. "I was wondering when you were going to put in an appearance," said Mrs. Bird, as Paddington poked his head around the kitchen door with an inquiring look on his face. "I've never known such a bear for smelling out things." Mrs. Bird hastily closed the oven door before Paddington could see inside, and then began dishing up his breakfast. "Don't go eating too much," she warned. "We're having a party this afternoon, and I've enough to feed a regiment of bears." "A party!" exclaimed Paddington, looking more and more surprised. Paddington liked parties. Since he'd been with the Browns, they'd had quite a number of Christmas and birthday ones, but it was most unusual to have a party in between times. "Never you mind," said Mrs. Bird mysteriously when he inquired what it was all about. "It's a party. That's all you need to know. And don't go getting egg all over your whiskers," she warned. "Mr. Gruber's been invited, and Mr. Curry, not to mention quite a few other people." Paddington carried his plate of bacon and eggs into the dining room and settled himself at the table with a thoughtful expression on his face. The more he considered the matter, the more mysterious it seemed. The most surprising thing of all was that the Browns' next-door neighbor had received an invitation, and Paddington decided it must be a very important occasion indeed. Mr. Curry often turned up at the Browns' parties, but almost always it was because he'd invited himself, and very rarely because he'd actually been invited. Jonathan and Judy were most unhelpful as well. They came into the dining room to say good morning, while Paddington was having his breakfast. But as soon as he asked what was going on, they both hurried out of the room again. "It's a special party, Paddington," said Judy, squeezing his paw as she left. "Just for you. But don't worry, you'll find out all about it later on." Even Mr. Gruber quickly changed the subject when Paddington asked him about it later that morning. "I think it's meant to be a bit of a surprise, Mr. Brown," was all he would say. And a surprise wouldn't be a surprise if you knew what it was. Before any more questions could be asked, Mr. Gruber hastily broke a bun in two and gave one half to Paddington before disappearing into the darkness at the back of his shop to make the morning cocoa. When he returned, he was carrying a large book on the cocoa tray. "I expect we shall be having fun and games this afternoon, Mr. Brown," he said, as he handed the book to Paddington. "I thought you might like to have a browse through this. It's a bumper book of party tricks." Paddington thanked Mr. Gruber, and after he had finished his cocoa, he hurried back in the direction of Windsor Gardens. Mrs. Bird had warned him that with a party in the offing, there would be a lot of work to do, and he didn't want to be late home. Apart from that, Mr. Gruber's fun book looked very interesting, and he was anxious to test some of the tricks before lunch. But as it happened, all thoughts of party games passed completely out of his mind as he reached home. While he had been out, everyone else had been busy, and a great change had come over the dining room. An extra leaf had been put in the table, and the snow-white cloth was barely visible beneath all the food. Paddington's eyes grew larger and larger as he took in the dishes of jelly, fruit, and cream, and the plates laden with sandwiches and cakes, not to mention mounds of biscuits and piles of jam and marmalade. In the middle of it all, in a place of honor, was a large iced cake. The cake had some foreign words written across the top, but before he had time to make out what they were, Mrs. Bird discovered him and drove him up to the bathroom. "You'll have to be at the front door to welcome your guests," she warned. "You can collect as many marmalade stains as you like this afternoon, but not before." With that, Paddington had to be content. But as the time for the party drew near, he became more and more excited. The Browns had invited not only Mr. Gruber and Mr. Curry, but a number of the traders from the Portobello Road as well. Despite his habit of driving a hard bargain, Paddington was a popular bear in the market. And by the time all the guests had arrived, the Browns' dining room was full almost to overflowing. When the last of the visitors had settled themselves comfortably, Mr. Brown called for silence. "As you all know," he began, "this is Paddington's party. I have an important announcement to make later on, but first of all, I think Paddington himself wants to entertain you with a few special tricks he has up his paw.